The star city of Vel-Soreth didn't look dead at first. From a distance, through the observation glass of the transit vessel, it looked like something sleeping. Its spires caught the ambient light of the nearby dwarf star and scattered it in pale copper ribbons. Its rings, there were 3 of them stacked at uneven angles like coins dropped carelessly on a table, still rotated, though sluggishly, like the last revolution of a wheel that had forgotten why it was spinning. Mara Holt pressed her palm flat against the glass. She wasn't supposed to be here. The docking permit she'd filed listed her as a structural assessment consultant, on behalf of a small independent firm called Groundwork Solutions, which was technically true in the same way that calling the ocean some water was technically true. Groundwork Solutions was her. She'd registered it on a Tuesday afternoon in a rental apartment in Lisbon, paid the filing fee with money she'd borrowed from her sister, and spent the following 6 months convincing the Interstellar Commerce Bureau that a single human woman with a background in adaptive civil engineering had any business petitioning for access to a derelict Vel-class station condemned by the Galactic Architecture Commission 14 years ago. They'd laughed. Not unkindly, which was somehow worse. The transit officer who processed her final clearance, a Thavari, all 4 of his sensory clusters arranged thoughtfully as he reviewed her documentation, had tilted his head at the precise angle that translated in Thavari body language as gentle pity. "You understand," he said, "that 3 collective review teams have assessed Vel-Soreth. The conclusion was unanimous and was reached through the Oren methodology, which is not a simple process. It models 42,000 structural and thermodynamic variables simultaneously." "I know," Mara said. The findings were not borderline. The station's core lattice experienced a meridian collapse. That's not damage. That's a category. It means the structural logic of the entire. "I've read the report," she said. "All 9 volumes." He looked at her the way people look at someone who has just announced they plan to swim across an ocean. Not with anger. With something quieter and sadder than anger. "The Commission has marked it as a heritage ruin," he said. "It's protected. You can assess. You cannot touch anything without a Stage 2 development permit, which I've also filed." She slid the document across his desk. "It's pending review." He stared at the document. Then at her. Then back at the document. "This was filed 3 days ago." "Yes. Stage 2 reviews take a standard cycle. 14 months. "I'm aware. So you've come to assess a station you cannot yet legally modify, on behalf of a firm with no prior Vel-class experience, using a methodology you have not disclosed in your application, to potentially rebuild something that the 3 most respected engineering collectives in this arm of the galaxy have already deemed structurally irrecoverable." Mara picked up her bag. "That's a very accurate summary," she said, and walked toward the boarding gate. The Galactic Architecture Commission maintained a small observer post at Vel-Soreth. A sleek, pressurized module bolted to one of the station's outer rings like a barnacle on the side of a shipwreck. It housed a rotating team of 2 commission observers, whose job was to monitor the station's ongoing degradation and update the heritage preservation logs. When Mara's shuttle docked, both observers were waiting. Their names, as they introduced themselves, were Architect Senior Vale and Architect Adjunct Sen. They were Uvari, a species whose bodies were narrow and very tall, with elongated fingers and a bioluminescent stripe that ran from each temple down to the jaw, flickering in patterns that served as a secondary communication channel beneath their spoken words. Vale's stripe pulsed in a slow, cool blue as he reviewed her credentials. Mara had spent enough time around Uvari to know that cool blue meant contained skepticism, the kind a person maintains when they've decided in advance that being openly dismissive would be unprofessional. "You're the groundwork consultant," he said. "Mara Holt." "Yes. Your application listed adaptive civil engineering as your primary discipline." "That's correct." "Adaptive civil engineering," Sen repeated. Her stripe was doing something more complex. A flicker pattern Mara didn't fully recognize, though she caught the edge of it. Something like bafflement held at a careful distance. "That's a terrestrial discipline. Load distribution, material reuse, retrofitting existing structures." "Mostly yes." "Vel-Soreth is not a terrestrial structure." "No," Mara agreed pleasantly. "It's more interesting than that." Vale's stripe went flat, which was harder to read. He gestured around the observation module at the screens that lined the walls, each one displaying a different section of the station in various states of collapse. A cross-section of the core lattice that looked like a bowl of broken glass. A ring segment that had buckled inward, its inner surface now a landscape of jutting metal ridges. An energy relay node that had fused into something resembling melted sculpture. Velsorith was built 400 years ago by the Sel Maru Collective, he said. Their engineering tradition was based on what we call resonant coherence. Every structural element was tuned to a specific harmonic frequency. The entire station functioned as a single unified system. No element was passive. Every beam, every joint, every conduit was load-bearing in the harmonic sense, not just the physical sense. I know, Mara said. When the core lattice failed, a cascading harmonic desynchronization triggered by a stellar flare of an unusual spectral signature. It didn't just break the structure. It broke the logic of the structure. The resonance patterns that held the system in coherence are gone. To rebuild Velsorith using Sel Maru methods would require recreating those patterns from scratch, which would require either a functioning Sel Maru resonance forge, of which none exist, as the Sel Maru have been extinct for 2 centuries, or a complete harmonic remapping of the station's geometry, which our modeling suggests would take between 60 and 90 standard years and resources equivalent to the GDP of a mid-tier interstellar nation. He paused. You have filed a Stage 2 permit, he said. And you are one person. 2, Mara said. My sister is joining me next week. She does logistics. The silence in the room was of a particular quality. The kind of silence that forms when people are being very deliberate about not saying what they're thinking. Sen's bioluminescent stripe had settled into a pattern Mara finally recognized. Sadness for someone who doesn't yet know they're lost. Mara's sister Claire arrived 9 days later, because the transit schedule from the nearest hub was irregular and Claire had missed the first connection due to a mix-up involving her luggage and a cargo drone. She came through the docking collar dragging a case the size of a small refrigerator and wearing an expression of profound irritation that softened slightly when she saw Mara. You look terrible, Claire said. I've been sleeping in the survey module. The one bolted to the broken ring? It's the only one with a window that faces the interior atrium. I need to see it in natural light. The artificial spectrum in the observer post is calibrated for Uvari visual range. I was missing about 30% of what I was actually looking at. Claire set down her case, looked around at the survey module, which was small, drafty in the way that pressurized spaces sometimes were when their seals were aging, and covered in Mara's notes, and said, Okay. Walk me through it. This was the thing about Claire. She asked good questions and she didn't flinch. Mara walked her through it. The Sel Maru had built Velsorith on a principle that the Commission's reports described as resonant coherence, which was accurate but incomplete. What the reports measured was the effect, the harmonic tuning of structural elements. What they were less precise about was the intent behind it. Because the Sel Maru, based on everything Mara had read about them in the xenoarchaeological archives, had not thought about engineering the way the current galactic architectural traditions did. The dominant tradition, the one the Commission represented, was what scholars called integral design. You model a system completely before you build it. You account for every variable. Every element has a defined role and a defined load and a defined relationship to every other element. It was extraordinarily precise. It produced extraordinary things. The Uvari orbital platforms. The Thavari atmospheric processors. The Kethmaran relay network. It also meant that when something broke outside the model's parameters, the system's integrity was catastrophically compromised. Because nothing in an integrally designed system was meant to do anything other than exactly what it was designed to do. The Sel Maru had worked differently. They overbuilt redundancy, Mara said, standing in front of the largest of her wall-mounted diagrams, a hand-annotated cross-section of the station's mid-ring, covered in her own color-coded markings. Not redundancy in the usual sense. Not backup systems. They built structural elements that did more than one thing simultaneously. A beam that was load-bearing was also a harmonic conduit, was also a thermal exchange surface, was also, in some cases, part of the atmospheric system. Everything was doing at least 3 jobs. Claire studied the diagram. So when the cascade hit, everything failed at once, yes. That's what the Commission focused on. That's why they called it irrecoverable. Because in their model, if the harmonic system is gone, the structural logic is gone, and you'd need to rebuild the harmonic system first before you could rebuild anything else. But Mara pointed to a section of the diagram she'd marked in red. But the redundancy didn't fully die. It can't, it's baked into the geometry. The shapes of the elements encode the resonance relationships. Even without active harmonic tuning, the passive geometry still has echoes of the original system. They're not functional. But they're legible. Claire was quiet for a moment. You're saying the building is still telling you what it was? Yes. And you want to use that to rebuild it without the Sel Maru technology? Without recreating the Sel Maru system at all? using different methods to achieve structurally equivalent outcomes. She paused. The Commission's model assumes the only valid solution is restoration, putting it back the way it was. I'm not trying to restore it. I'm trying to do something closer to what a doctor does when a patient's original organ can't be saved. You don't grow a new one from scratch if you don't have the equipment. You find something that can do the job. Claire looked at her for a long moment. The Commission is going to hate this, she said. They already hate it, Mara said. I'd like to give them a better reason. The Stage 2 permit came through 6 weeks later, faster than the standard cycle, which Mara suspected was less because of any merit in her application and more because the Commission observer Vale had filed a secondary report noting that the assessment consultant appeared to be conducting preliminary structural modeling that, if allowed to proceed without oversight, might result in unauthorized contact with heritage materials. Granting her the permit was cheaper than prosecuting her. She chose to view it as a vote of confidence. The first thing she did once the permit was active was spend 3 weeks touching nothing. She moved through the station with a handheld resonance mapper, a device she'd modified from a standard geological survey tool, recalibrating its sensitivity range to capture the passive geometric harmonics she'd identified in her analysis. She mapped every corridor she could safely access. She cataloged the echoes. Vale followed her on the second day. He didn't say anything. He watched her work with an expression she couldn't fully read. The bioluminescent stripe was doing something quiet and complicated that she didn't have the vocabulary for. On the fourth day he spoke. What are you recording? Passive harmonic residue, she said. The geometry still holds the memory of the original resonance relationships. I'm building a map of what the system wanted to be. That data is already in the Commission archives. Not at this resolution. And not annotated for what I'm looking for. He watched her for another few minutes. What are you looking for? She showed him the mapper's display. A three-dimensional web of faint signal lines, color-coded by frequency range. Structural elements that are still doing at least 2 of their original jobs. The harmonic function is gone. But the load-bearing and thermal exchange functions in some elements are still partially active. Those are my anchors. Vale studied the display. His stripe flickered, a very fast pattern, gone before she could read it. He said nothing and walked back toward the observer post. The thing about working in a condemned structure is that the structure has opinions. Vel Soreth expressed its opinions through sound. The station groaned in 3 distinct registers, a low, constant vibration that Mara eventually stopped noticing, a mid-frequency creak that meant thermal expansion as the dwarf star's light cycled through the observation windows, and a sharp, irregular clatter that she spent 4 days tracking to a section of the eastern ring where a failed support strut was making intermittent contact with a loose panel. She secured the panel with a clamp she'd brought from her supply kit. It was a heavy-duty construction clamp, bright orange, designed for terrestrial use. It sat against the station's copper and silver metalwork like a crayon mark on a museum painting. Vale saw it the next morning. He stared at it for a long time. That is not a Vel-class approved fastening material, he said. I know. But the panel was going to work loose and hit the strut and eventually compromise the strut's remaining load capacity. The clamp stops that while I work on a permanent solution. The Commission archives have 347 approved fastening materials for Vel Soreth's exterior alloy composition. Yes. And the nearest supplier for any of them is 11 days away by cargo transit. She looked at the clamp. The clamp is holding fine. Vale's stripe went cool blue again. She thought about explaining further, about how the choice wasn't between the right tool and the wrong tool, but between the available tool and no tool, and how the entire history of her discipline was built on that distinction, but she could tell he wasn't ready to hear it yet. She went back to her mapping instead. The rebuild proper began in the 4th month. Not at the core, that would come later when she had enough anchor points established. She started at the periphery of the eastern ring, in a section that the Commission had classified as Tier 3 degradation, significant structural compromise, but not yet an active collapse. She was working with a small team by then. Claire on logistics and supply coordination, a structural welder named Osei who had worked in orbital salvage for 15 years and had the particular gift of understanding what metal wanted to do when you weren't looking at it, and a Thavari systems analyst named Quiv who had answered Mara's employment listing with a message that said simply, "This is the strangest job posting I have seen this year. I am interested." They worked with what was there, supplemented by what could be sourced within reasonable transit windows. The Commission's approach to the station's damaged elements would have been removal and replacement. Extract the compromised material, install certified replacements of equivalent specification. Mara's approach was different. She was looking at each damaged element and asking a different question. Not what should replace this, but what is this still capable of doing and what else could it do? The eastern ring's inner support lattice had partially collapsed. A 40-meter section where the original cell Maru resonance joints had failed and the load had shifted catastrophically. The Commission's report had recommended full extraction of the failed section and replacement with temporary shoring until certified structural restoration could be conducted. Mara looked at the failed section and saw something else. The collapse hadn't been random. The geometry of the failure, the specific angles at which elements had buckled, the precise locations where they'd held, traced a pattern that matched, almost exactly, an alternative load distribution geometry she'd identified in the passive harmonic mapping. The section hadn't just failed. It had failed towards something. It's like the building was trying to find a new equilibrium, she told Osei, standing in the collapsed section with survey lights casting long shadows through the tangle of buckled struts. It didn't make it. It ran out of structural capacity before it could stabilize. But it got most of the way there. Osei studied the angles. He was a quiet man with a habit of running his thumb along structural edges before he spoke, like he was reading them. You want to help it finish the job, he said. We add 4 secondary struts here, here, and here, she marked the positions on her tablet, to carry the load that the original geometry couldn't quite redistribute, and we reinforce the junction points where the lattice did hold. We're not restoring the original structure. We're completing a transition the structure already started. Osei ran his thumb along one of the buckled struts. That's not in any engineering manual I've read, he said. No, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. I'll start on the secondary struts, he said. Vale watched the work without comment for 3 days. On the 4th day he brought a sensor array from the observer post and set it up in the eastern ring's corridor, pointing at the section they were modifying. What are you measuring? Mara asked. Load distribution, he said. I want to see what happens when you add the secondary struts. She didn't say anything. She went back to work. When the 3rd secondary strut went in and they ran the first post-installation load test, the sensor array showed something unexpected. Not just load redistribution in the modified section, but a faint ripple of harmonic activity. Not functional resonance. A ghost of it. As if the geometry being closer to equilibrium had woken some residual memory in the surrounding metal. Vale stared at his sensors for a long time. His stripe was doing the fast flicker pattern again. This time she caught more of it. Dissonance was the word that came to her, not the negative kind. The kind that happens when something doesn't fit any available category. 6 months in, the Galactic Architecture Commission sent a formal review delegation. There were 5 of them, 3 Uvari, 1 Thavari, and 1 species Mara didn't recognize, tall and very still, with eyes that moved independently. They arrived in a commission vessel that made Mara's survey shuttle look like a life raft beside an ocean liner. They set up in the observer post and spent 2 days reviewing Vale's logs and sensor data before they came to find her. She was in the atrium core when they arrived. The atrium was Velsoritha's centerpiece, a vast open space at the station's heart, where in its active years the different rings had met and where the architectural grandeur of the Cell Maru tradition had been most fully expressed. The ceiling, 400 meters above, was a latticed dome of interlocking curves. Most of it was intact. The floor was not. It had buckled in the initial cascade, creating an irregular landscape of raised and sunken sections like a frozen sea. Mara was standing in the middle of it, looking up, when the delegation found her. The lead Uvari, she introduced herself as Architect Principal Vor, looked at Mara for a moment, then looked up at the dome, then at the buckled floor, then at Mara's survey equipment and markers. The Eastern Ring modifications, Vor said. We've reviewed the sensor data. I assumed you would, Mara said. The secondary strut configuration is structurally sound. We'll concede that. The concession sounded like it cost something. What we're struggling to understand is how you determine the specific geometry. Our modeling team ran the parameters through the Orin methodology. The configuration you chose is one of approximately 11 million possible arrangements for secondary support in that section. Our models rank it 432nd in terms of overall structural efficiency. That's right, Mara said. Vor paused. You chose a configuration ranked 432nd. I chose the configuration that completed the structure's existing failure trajectory rather than reversing it. She pulled up the mapping data on her tablet and handed it to Vor. Configurations 1 through 431 are more efficient if you're building from a stable baseline. But this station wasn't a stable baseline. It was mid-process. Interrupting that process and trying to redirect it would have required significantly more intervention. More force, more material, more time, than completing it. Vor studied the tablet. The other delegation members gathered behind her, looking at the data over her shoulder. This is a philosophical distinction, Vor said. It's an engineering distinction, Mara said. But yes, it has philosophical implications. Your approach treats the failure condition as a form of information rather than a problem to be eliminated. The failure condition was a form of information. The building was telling me something about what it could become. I chose to listen. The tall, still delegate, she still didn't know the species name, spoke for the first time. The voice was a low harmonic, translated through a device at the collar. You are saying that the criteria for optimal design changes when the system is already in motion. Yes. That is not a concept present in the Oren methodology. I know. The Oren methodology is designed to evaluate structures from zero. It's extraordinarily good at that. It's less equipped for structures that are already somewhere in the middle of their own story. The silence had a different quality than the silences she'd navigated before. The earlier silences had been the silence of people waiting for her to finish so they could explain why she was wrong. This silence was the silence of people who had encountered something that required actual processing. Vor handed back the tablet. What is your timeline for the atrium core? 14 months if the Stage 3 permits process on schedule. What does Stage 3 entail? Mara looked up at the dome. The hardest part, she said. The atrium dome was the problem she'd been thinking about since the beginning. The Eastern Ring modifications were complex, but they followed a logic she could trace step by step. The dome was different. The dome's structural integrity had not failed because of physical damage. It had failed because of the harmonic collapse. The dome's geometry was so precisely tuned to the original cell-Maru resonance system that without it, the dome was essentially a held breath. Still intact, but one significant seismic event or external pressure shift away from catastrophic failure. The Commission's position was that the dome should be demolished in a controlled manner before it fell in an uncontrolled one. Mara's position was that she wasn't going to demolish one of the most architecturally significant structures in the known galaxy if she could help it. The solution she'd been working toward, the one she hadn't fully told anyone about yet, because she wasn't sure it would work, involved the harmonic residue she'd been mapping since the beginning. The passive geometric harmonics couldn't function as a structural system. She'd been clear-eyed about that from the start. They were echoes, not engines. But she'd been looking at them from the wrong angle. It wasn't the passive harmonics that mattered. It was what happened when physical systems resonated with them. She'd noticed it first in the Eastern Ring, the ghost of harmonic activity when the secondary struts brought the geometry closer to equilibrium. She'd spent 2 months quietly investigating whether that effect was reproducible. The answer, based on careful sensor work she'd conducted in several different sections of the station, was yes. When you brought a damaged structural section close enough to its original geometric equilibrium, not perfectly, just close, the surrounding material produced faint resonant echoes. Not enough to function, but enough to measure. And if you could measure them, you could map them. And if you could map them, you could find the note the structure was trying to sing. What she wanted to do with the dome was not to restore its harmonic function. She wanted to use the dome's own residual geometry to identify the minimum intervention points, the smallest possible set of physical changes, that would bring the dome to a self-sustaining mechanical equilibrium that didn't depend on harmonic tuning at all. The cell-Maru had built the dome to function in a specific way. She was trying to find a way to let it function in a different way, one that respected what it had been while allowing it to survive what it had become. She explained this to Quiv late one night, sitting in the survey module with cold coffee and a three-dimensional holographic model of the dome that rotated slowly above the table between them. Quiv was quiet for a long time after she finished. The Commission will say you're changing the heritage structure, he said finally. I'm preserving the heritage structure. I'm changing its operating principle. They may not distinguish between those things. Then I'll need to show them instead of telling them. Quiv studied the rotating model. He was a precise person. His analyses were always ordered and careful, but she'd noticed that when he was genuinely interested in something, he leaned forward very slightly. He was leaning forward now. The minimum intervention points, he said. How many? My current modeling says 17. Possibly as few as 12. For a 400-meter dome. Yes. He stopped. Reconsidered. That's either the most efficient structural intervention I've ever heard of or a dangerous underestimation. It might be both, Mara said. That's what the next 6 months are for. The commission filed a formal objection to her Stage 3 permit application. She expected it. They cited 3 specific concerns: potential heritage modification beyond approved parameters, insufficient modeling data to support the proposed intervention, and, this one she hadn't anticipated, the possibility that her approach might influence Velsortha's status as a protected heritage site in ways that would affect the Commission's legal jurisdiction over it. That last one told her something she filed away carefully. The objection wasn't purely about whether her approach would work. Part of it was about what it would mean if it did. She amended the application, addressed the first 2 objections with additional documentation, and left the third one alone. There was nothing she could say about it that would help. Architect Principal Vor contacted her 3 days after the amended application went in. "I need to ask you something directly," Vor said. "Go ahead. If your approach succeeds, if the dome stabilizes on mechanical equilibrium without harmonic function, you will have rebuilt a Sel Maru heritage structure using methods the Sel Maru never used. The station will no longer be what it was." "It's already not what it was," Mara said. "You know what I mean." "I do." She paused. "Yes. Will be different. It will be a thing that survived by changing. I think that's worth more than a ruin that's exactly what it was." Vor's stripe flickered. The pattern was one Mara was beginning to recognize. Something between consideration and resistance, the colors of a mind working against its own training. "The Sel Maru," Vor said slowly, "valued what they called Veth en El Soreth. There's no good translation. Something like, the continuation of a thing's essential nature through change. It was one of their core design principles. The idea that a structure could transform and still remain, in some meaningful sense, itself." Mara didn't say anything. "I am not saying," Vor said carefully, "that your approach aligns with Sel Maru philosophy. I am saying I find it interesting that you arrived at something adjacent to it without knowing the term." "I didn't know the term," Mara said. "No." Vor was quiet for a moment. "I'll review the amended application personally." The Stage 3 permit came through in 6 weeks. The dome work began on a morning when the dwarf star was at the angle that sent light directly through the atrium's eastern windows and illuminated the dome's interior surface in long, warm diagonals. Mara had scheduled it deliberately. She needed to see the dome in that light. She'd been looking at it for months in survey lighting and holographic models in data. She wanted to begin the actual work in the light the station had been designed to receive. She and Osei and 2 additional structural specialists she'd brought in, a woman named Petra who specialized in stress fracture analysis and a soft-spoken man named Damien who had spent 12 years working on the restoration of ancient terrestrial bridges, stood in the atrium and looked up at the dome as the light moved across it. 17 points, Damien said. 12 to 18 depending on what we find when we get closer to the dome surface, Mara said. But 17 is the center of my confidence interval. You've worked on older structures than this? Petra asked Damien. Terrestrial ones. 19th and 20th century suspension bridges, mostly. He tilted his head back, studying the dome. The principle isn't entirely different. Old bridges weren't designed to code. They were designed by feel, by builders who understood materials intuitively but couldn't model the physics formally. When they fail in ways that formal modeling doesn't fully predict. You have to read the failure in the thing itself. That's what she's been doing, Osei said. He was looking at Mara. That's what I've been trying to do, she agreed. They went to work. The first 3 intervention points went exactly as modeled. The 4th revealed something unexpected. At the 40-meter elevation on the dome's northwestern quadrant, when Petra's crew opened the access panel to reach the intervention point, they found that the Sel Maru had built something inside the dome's double-wall structure that didn't appear in any of the commission's surveys or the station's available schematics. A secondary lattice. Thin as thread but running in complex patterns through the wall cavity. Not structural, it had no load-bearing function. Not electrical. Not thermal. Mara spent 6 hours in the cavity with a scanner before she understood what she was looking at. It was a resonance record. The Sel Maru had embedded in the walls of the dome a physical archive of the dome's original harmonic patterns. Not just the frequencies, the full relational geometry. The way each element's resonance related to every other element's resonance. The whole system preserved in the structure of the lattice itself. She sat in the cavity for a long time in the dark, holding her scanner, looking at the threads of the lattice in her lamp's light. The Sel Maru had known, she thought, that harmonics were fragile. They had known that what they were building might someday lose its voice. And so they had left, inside the walls, a record of what that voice had been. Not instructions for restoration. Just A memory. A way for someone who came later to know what the dome had been. Veth Nal Soreth. The continuation of a thing's essential nature through change. She photographed everything. She documented the lattice in full, cross-referenced it against her passive harmonic mapping data, and sent the raw files to Claire with a note that said, "Don't share this yet. I need to think." She continued the dome work. 17 intervention points as modeled. When the last one was in place and they ran the load test, the dome settled, a long, slow redistribution of stress that took 4 hours to reach equilibrium. They sat in the atrium and watched the structural sensors in real time, the numbers shifting, the load patterns reorganizing. When the sensor stabilized, Petra said, "It's holding," in a voice that didn't fully believe what it was saying. The dome was holding. Not the way it had been designed to hold. Differently. Through a mechanical equilibrium that the Cell Maru had never intended, that the Commission had never modeled, that no formal methodology Mara was aware of had described. Through a logic that had been learned, in part, from the structure's own record of itself. Architect Principal Vor arrived at Vel Soreth 14 months after Mara had begun work. The Commission Observer post had been upgraded twice since then, first to accommodate the review delegation, then to accommodate a semi-permanent team that had been quietly studying Mara's methodology for the past 8 months. Vale was still there. His reports, which Claire had obtained through a Freedom of Records filing, had shifted in tone so gradually that no single entry marked the change, but reading them in sequence you could trace a mind moving. From assessment consultant continues unconventional approach to structural results of unconventional approach require further study to, most recently, recommend extended documentation of methodology for theoretical review. Vor walked through the eastern ring first. The corridor was straight and solid, the modified section indistinguishable by eye from the sections that had never failed. Then she went to the atrium. She stood in the center of the floor looking up at the dome. The light came through the eastern windows at the angle Mara had first worked in. The dome's interior surface caught it and did something the Commission surveys had never mentioned. A faint, complex pattern of light and shadow as the dome's geometry scattered the incoming wavelengths. Not random. The pattern repeated on a cycle that matched the dwarf star's rotation period. The Cell Maru designed that, Mara said. She was standing beside Vor. The light pattern. It's in the original schematics. The dome's interior geometry was calibrated to produce that effect at certain solar angles. I didn't know about it until I found the resonance record in the walls. But my intervention geometry preserved it by accident. By accident, Vor said. I was following the dome's own geometry. The light pattern is a product of that geometry. I didn't design it. I just didn't destroy it. Vor was quiet for a long moment. The resonance record, she said. You found it 4 months ago. Yes. You didn't report it to the Commission immediately. I reported it when I fully understood what it was. That took 3 months. And the 4th month? I spent it thinking about what to do with it. Vor turned to look at her. The bioluminescent stripe was doing something Mara had never seen from a Uvari, a slow, rolling pattern, deep gold shifting to amber, that she had no word for. What did you decide? The resonance record is a heritage document of significant cultural value. It belongs in the Commission archives. I'm donating it. She paused. I'm also proposing that it be housed here at Vel Soreth, in a permanent interpretive installation in the atrium, so that people who visit the station can understand what it was, alongside what it is. What it was and what it is, Vor repeated. They're not the same thing. But they're part of the same story. Vor looked back up at the dome. The light pattern shifted slowly as the star's angle changed. The Commission is going to want to discuss your methodology, she said. Formally. At the next full convening. You would be the first non-commission entity to present before a full architectural convening in 40 years. I know, Mara said. I've thought about what I would say. What would you say? That I didn't prove anything about human ingenuity. I didn't prove that any particular method is superior. I proved that there are different kinds of knowledge, and that they're not in competition with each other, they're in conversation. The Oren methodology knows things I don't know. My methodology knows things the Oren methodology doesn't know. The dome is standing because I used both, and because the Cell Maru 200 years ago had the wisdom to leave a record that I could read. She looked up at the light. I didn't rebuild Vel Soreth despite the galactic architectural tradition. I rebuilt it because of the Cell Maru tradition that built it, and the Commission tradition that preserved it, and my own tradition that taught me to listen to what a broken thing is trying to become. Vor was silent. Her stripe pulsed once in a color Mara had never seen it before. Warm, clear, unambiguous. Recognition. Vel Soreth reopened 14 months later. Not all of it. The full restoration would take years more, and there were sections Mara had designated for careful long-term work rather than rapid intervention. But the eastern ring was operational, the atrium was open, and the dome stood above it all in its recovered light. The opening was not a grand ceremony. Mara had specifically requested against a grand ceremony. There was a small gathering in the atrium. The team, the commission observers, Vore and 2 other architects, a handful of journalists from interstellar media outlets whose editors had been skeptical that the story was worth covering and were now less skeptical. Claire had sourced food from 6 different species' culinary traditions, which was either a diplomatic achievement or an ambitious disaster, and turned out to be mostly the former. Mara stood near the center of the atrium floor and watched people move through the space. She watched a pair of Thavari visitors tilt their sensory clusters upward to look at the dome. She watched a journalist, a young human woman she was pleased to note, hold up her recording device and try to capture the light pattern, which wouldn't quite translate to recorded media but kept drawing people to try anyway. She watched Vale stand at the edge of the room with a stillness that she had come to recognize, over the past 2 years, as his version of being moved. She thought about the resonance record, now digitized and archived and installed in a reading room off the atrium's east corridor. A quiet room with good light, where you could sit and look at the physical record the Cell Maru had left inside their own walls and follow the relationships between the harmonic patterns and understand, even without the engineering background, that this was an act of care. Someone had looked at what they were building and thought, someone will come after us and they will need to know what this was. Osei appeared beside her with 2 cups of something warm. How does it feel? He asked. She considered the question seriously. Strange, she said. I spent 2 years thinking about what the station needed. Now that it doesn't need me anymore, I'm not entirely sure what to do with myself. You have the Western Ring. The Western Ring is a different problem. Different failure modes, different geometry. She paused. I'll need to start the mapping from scratch. Terrible news, he said drily. She almost smiled. Yes. The light shifted. The dome's pattern moved across the floor in slow arcs. Somewhere in the walls, in the lattice threads the Cell Maru had woven into the stone, the memory of what the dome had been continued to exist, not as a ghost, not as a wound, but as a resource. A record that said, this is what we knew and we trusted that knowledge to outlast us. Mara thought that was the thing worth saying when she spoke at the commission convening. Not that humanity was stubborn or ingenious or undefeatable. Those things were sometimes true and sometimes not, and they were less interesting than the real story. The real story was that knowledge was patient. That a broken thing could hold its own history inside itself. That listening, actually listening, to sensors and to silence and to the grain of metal that had been shaped by hands 2 centuries gone, was itself a form of engineering. That the distance between impossible and merely not yet attempted was sometimes very small, and the tool you needed to close it was not cleverness, was attention. 3 years after Mara Holt first docked at Vel Soreth with a borrowed case of survey equipment and a Stage 2 permit no one expected her to use, the Galactic Architecture Commission published a methodological supplement to the Oran methodology. It was titled, in the Commission's typically precise and somewhat airless naming convention, Supplement 7. Dynamic State Structural Analysis, Frameworks for Evaluation of Systems Under Active Transition. The lead author was architect Principal Vore. The acknowledgments, unusual for a commission publication, included a personal note. It read, this supplement would not exist without the work conducted at Vel Soreth by M. Holt and the Groundwork Solutions team, whose approach to structural intervention in heritage structures opened methodological possibilities that formal review had not anticipated. The author notes with particular interest that the core insight, that a system in transition contains information about its own optimal path forward, is not new. It is present in different language in the Cell Maru design philosophy that produced Vel Soreth itself. The supplement represents an attempt to formalize what was, perhaps, always implicit in what we were studying. Mara read this in the survey module she still used when she was working at the station, the one bolted to what was now the fully restored Eastern Ring, no longer drafty, its seals replaced in the 2nd year of work. The window still faced the interior atrium. She still used it for the light. She read the acknowledgement twice. Then she forwarded it to Claire, who responded within minutes with a message that was entirely lowercase and said only, okay, that's actually kind of beautiful, I'm not crying, you're crying. She forwarded it to Quiv, who sent back a carefully formatted analysis of the supplement's methodological implications with a brief postscript that said, also, well done. She forwarded it to Osei, who didn't respond for 2 days and then sent a photograph. It was a picture of the Eastern Ring corridor, taken from the section they'd modified first. The section where the structure's failure trajectory had been completed rather than reversed. The orange clamp was still there. She hadn't removed it when the permanent solution went in. She'd asked Osei to leave it, and he'd understood without her explaining why. The photograph was taken at the angle where the corridor's light came in at the same warm diagonal as the atrium dome's best hour. The clamp sat in the middle of the frame, bright orange against silver, exactly what it was. A temporary thing that had done its job, left in place as a reminder that the available tool and the right tool were sometimes the same tool, if you were paying enough attention. She printed the photograph and pinned it to the wall above her workstation. The Western Ring was not going to map itself. She picked up her scanner and went to work. Indy.